Mary Ann married her husband Paul when she was only 19 years old. They had been high school sweethearts and rushed into marriage without having any important conversations, such as how many children they wanted and whether they planned to have their aging parents move in with them. If Mary Ann had known the answer to these questions, she never would have married Paul. Mary Ann had always wanted a big family, with at least 3 kids. Paul only wanted 1. When their only son Daniel was 6 years old, they moved into a larger house. Mary Ann got her hopes up, thinking the extra bedroom might be for another baby. But to her absolute horror, she found that the extra bedroom was for her mother-in-law, Gertrude. Paul and Gertrude had planned this without ever consulting Mary Ann. Gertrude had been a single mother, and Paul had always just assumed that she would be living with them in her old age. Mary Ann, however, thought it was perfectly acceptable to send elderly parents to a nursing home, provided that they visit often and plan regular outings. Mary Ann protested this new living arrangement that had been forced onto her, but Paul refused to even consider Mary Ann's point of view. Gertrude was still independent and didn't need to be taken care of. For Mary Ann, the future looked bleak. Knowing that Gertrude could live another 15 to 20 years as an unwanted guest in her home sent her into a deep depression. Mary Ann despised Gertrude. The sight of her made Mary Ann feel physically sick, and the sound of her voice made her want to plunge sharp objects deep into her ear canals, just so she wouldn't have to hear her talk. Even the mention of Gertrude's name made Mary Ann's skin crawl. Gertrude was the type of person who was always giving unwanted advice. She thought very highly of herself and seemed to assume that she knew more than anyone else about all subjects. She used her religion as a pedestal of self-righteousness and could never do a single good deed without posting it on social media. Gertrude also considered herself to be extremely attractive, even in her mid-70s, and dressed far too provocatively for a woman her age. But this wasn't why Mary Ann hated her. When Daniel was only a baby, Gertrude had tried to declare Mary Ann an unfit mother and take Daniel for herself. Paul did nothing to intervene. Daniel neither liked nor disliked Gertrude, but he noticed that his mother always seemed stressed and anxious in her presence. He also noticed that if Mary Ann wasn't working in her home office, she hardly ever left her bedroom. She never cooked anymore because Gertrude had taken over the kitchen. Daniel mentioned this to Paul one day when they were alone, but Paul just said, "Well, Grandma makes better food anyway." Daniel didn't think so. Mary Ann found the relationship between Paul and Gertrude disturbing, bordering on emotional incest. She knew that Paul favoured his mother and would always take her side over his wife. Mary Ann didn't know what to do. She'd always struggled with boundaries and assertiveness, but she knew she would have to do something. Then one day it came to her. Mary Ann pulled herself out of her depressive state and went to place an ad in the newspaper. A week later, she got a response from a woman named Dot. She was about Gertrude's age and wanted to help Mary Ann, as she too had experienced great difficulties with her mother-in-law as a young woman. They met in person to discuss the plan before putting it into action. Dot was going to pretend to be Mary Ann's estranged aunt and move in with them with the promise of a very large inheritance. Mary Ann knew that Paul could be persuaded by money. Dot would then proceed to do the most unhinged, batshit crazy stuff she could think of when Paul and Danny weren't around. And then the two women would gaslight everyone into believing it had been Gertrude who was doing these things. Because it was only a 3-bedroom house, Dot had to stay in the same room as Gertrude. Gertrude did not approve of this, but just as Mary Ann had anticipated, Paul was able to persuade her after being promised a substantial amount of money at the end of Dot's stay. So Gertrude and Dot stayed in the same room with 2 single beds on opposite ends. Dot didn't do anything outrageous straight away. She wanted to ease into it to avoid suspicion. However, on her first night in the home, when everyone sat down to eat the evening meal which Gertrude had prepared, Dot took one bite, screwed up her face and said, "I'm sorry, I can't eat this." "You don't know good food," Gertrude snapped, giving Dot the evil eye. "Honey, I was owner and head chef of a prestigious restaurant for over 40 years. You are the one who doesn't know good food," Dot replied. Then she stood up and said, "Come on, Marianne, let's go see what else we can make." Marianne pretended to look concerned, but once she was alone in the kitchen with Dot, she smiled. Dot whipped up an amazing 5-star meal just for her and Marianne. Everyone else had finished by the time they sat down to eat, but Daniel came over anyway and asked to try what Dot had made. He loved it and asked if Dot could cook dinner every night. Marianne looked over at Gertrude in the adjacent lounge room and had to suppress a giggle when she saw the expression of rage on Gertrude's face after hearing what Daniel had said. The following day, while Paul was at work and Daniel at school, Dot's friend Michelle came over. Michelle was actually Dot's daughter, who was in on the plan, but she introduced herself as her friend and former employee of the restaurant Dot had owned. Marianne made coffee and had a brief chat with Michelle and Dot before returning to her home office. When Gertrude came in to see what was going on, Michelle looked at her and exclaimed, "Oh my goodness, Dot, don't tell me this is your new roommate." Dot nodded her head and said, "Yes, this is Gertrude." Michelle swiftly walked over to Gertrude and said, "Gertrude, darling, we have got to do something about these clothes. Have you no shame with that sagging fat on your arms and chest out on display for everyone to see? And your makeup. If you don't know how to apply it, darling, then don't bother. You look like a bloated corpse." "It's true, Gertrude, you're scaring everyone," Dot chimed in. Marianne's home office was close enough to hear the conversation. She spat coffee all over her computer screen and had to pretend she was choking to hide her laugh. In all the time Marianne had known Gertrude, she had longed for someone to point these things out to her. Then Michelle just came right in and said what everyone was thinking. "Come shopping with us, Gertrude. We'll help you find some clothes that won't look so repugnant," Michelle went on. Gertrude abruptly left the room, ranting in German, her native tongue. When Paul got home from work, Gertrude immediately stormed over to tell him how rude Dot and her friend had been. "They only invited you to go shopping, Gertrude," Marianne said, appearing in the doorway. Dot was still out with Michelle. Gertrude proceeded to tell Paul exactly what had been said and screamed at him that she wanted Dot gone. "Paul, could I talk to you alone for a moment?" Marianne asked, gesturing towards her office. Paul followed her in and shut the door. "I could hear the conversation from here, Paul," Marianne whispered. "Nothing like that was ever said. They only invited her to go shopping with them. What kind of a person would have the audacity to just walk into someone's house and say those things? I think she's just upset about what happened at dinner last night." Paul didn't know what to think. A week later, Dot had a male friend over for afternoon tea. Just as Marianne had expected, Gertrude tried to get this man's attention. While Dot was in the kitchen preparing snacks, Gertrude sauntered in and attempted to flirt with him. Frank just stared at her and yelled, "Dot, why is this horrible woman talking to me?" "She expects that you'll find her attractive," Dot yelled back. Gertrude stomped her way into the kitchen and demanded to know why Dot's friend was being so rude to her. "Oh, don't worry about Frank. He has dementia," said Dot. Gertrude scoffed and went to her room. About a month after Dot moved in, the family had planned a day out at the adventure park. Dot came along with them and brought a picnic of gourmet sandwiches and wraps. Daniel had a great time on the playground with Marianne, while Paul, Gertrude and Dot enjoyed the nature scenery. As they were sitting down to have their picnic, Dot muttered something inaudible under her breath, then said, "Gertrude, I've been meaning to talk to you about those tight pants you wear. It can't be good for you, and honestly, it's not appropriate to be wearing something like that in the presence of children. Isn't it uncomfortable?" Gertrude glared at Dot, then Paul jumped in quickly and said, "Dot, that wasn't very polite." "It isn't very polite to have the full outline of one's vagina out on display," Dot replied. Everyone was silent for a moment, then Dot continued by saying, "It's unappealing even when young attractive women wear pants that tight. What makes you think anyone wants to see that, Gertrude? It looks like you've shoved an entire rotisserie chicken down your pants." "That's enough," snapped Paul. Then Marianne gently touched his arm and said, "It has always made me uncomfortable when she wears those pants in front of Danny. I think Dot has a point." Paul didn't know how to respond. He knew that Dot and Marianne were speaking the truth, but he didn't want to upset his mother. He grabbed a handful of sandwiches, then stood up and said, "Come on, Mum, let's go over to the pond." He helped Gertrude to her feet and they left. When they were out of earshot, Danny said, "I think those pants are disgusting." When they got home from the adventure park, Danny went straight to one of his gaming devices, while Marianne and Paul unpacked the car. Gertrude and Dot were in the kitchen washing Tupperware containers when Dot noticed a can of bug spray. She quickly picked it up, sprayed it directly into her own eyes, then screamed in pain and dropped the can. Marianne and Paul came running in. "What happened?" demanded Paul. "Gertrude sprayed that insect repellent into my eyes," Dot cried. "I did not. She's making it up," yelled Gertrude. "Why would she spray herself in the eyes with insect repellent, Gertrude?" asked Marianne, putting an arm around Dot's shoulder. "It must have been an accident," insisted Paul. Gertrude pointed her finger at Dot and said something vile in German. Marianne took Dot into the bathroom to help flush her eyes out, while Paul tried to comfort Gertrude. She insisted that the injury had been self-inflicted by Dot. Paul told Gertrude he believed her. For a couple of weeks, Dot didn't do anything to upset Gertrude, besides cooking delicious meals that everyone enjoyed more than the food Gertrude made. Then one night, when Gertrude was sound asleep, Dot crept over to her bed, slowly pulled back the covers and carefully squatted over her. Then she pissed in Gertrude's bed. Gertrude woke up just as Dot was making her way back into her own bed and screamed, "You pissed in my bed!" Dot, who was now back in her own bed, pretending to look confused, said, "Gertrude, why would I piss in your bed? That doesn't make any sense." Gertrude continued screaming until Paul and Marianne came to see what all the yelling was about. "She pissed in my bed," Gertrude screeched as she tried to attack Dot. Dot held the blanket up in front of herself as a shield and yelled, "Why would I piss in her bed? It's those tight pants she wears." Paul restrained Gertrude and helped her over to the bathroom. Marianne and Dot stripped the bed linen and put some fresh sheets on, quietly chuckling to themselves. When everyone was back in their own beds, Paul turned to Marianne and said, "Do you think it was Dot who pissed the bed?" Marianne turned to face Paul and said, "Now why on earth would she do that? Besides, there was no piss on the top blanket. There would have been if it were Dot." Paul was confused. He didn't want to believe that his mother had pissed the bed, but he couldn't understand why Dot would do such a thing either. He had always been oblivious to how much everyone around him disliked Gertrude. He had always assumed that everyone else thought she was just as fantastic as she thought she was. Since Dot moved in, his perception of Gertrude was slowly being chipped away. Paul didn't like it. Another week went by without incident. Dot had taken on most of the cooking, although Gertrude would still make food and try to pressure everyone into eating it. Paul was the only one who did. Whenever Dot was in the kitchen, Gertrude would hang around making snide comments. This didn't bother Dot, and she could tell her lack of retaliation irritated Gertrude. One night when Dot was setting the table, Gertrude was the only other person around, and Dot saw this as the perfect opportunity for chaos. She started hurling plates of food at the wall while shouting, "Gertrude, stop! What are you doing?" Then she ripped the tablecloth off the table, causing all the cutlery and drinking glasses to tumble to the floor. Gertrude was too shocked to say anything until Paul, Marianne, and Danny rushed in to see what was going on. Then she screamed, "It was her!" pointing an accusatory finger at Dot. Marianne started to clean up the mess, while Gertrude ranted and raved about how Dot was out to get her. All Dot had to say was, "Gertrude, I would never put so many expensive steaks to waste. Get a hold of yourself." Paul didn't know what to do. Danny asked if they could order pizza since dinner had been ruined. Paul agreed and went to go call their favourite pizza place. After cleaning up the mess, Marianne suggested that her and Dot go for a walk and give Gertrude time to calm down. Paul, Danny and Gertrude stayed back and ate the pizza. Gertrude made sure there was none left for Marianne and Dot when they returned. During the walk, Dot asked Marianne why Paul never said anything when Gertrude criticised her parenting. Marianne sighed and said, "He just thinks his mother knows best about everything. He's really inconsiderate of my feelings when she's around. If he were able to stand up to her and set boundaries, I wouldn't mind her being here so much, but he won't. What Gertrude wants has always been more important than what I want. I've wanted to call him out on it a few times, but I don't want him getting suspicious about why I'm really here," Dot replied. "You know, when Danny was a baby, before Gertrude tried to take him, we went out for dinner once and Danny needed to be changed. I went to go change him, and when I came back, Gertrude and Paul had left, even though I hadn't finished eating. She always does stuff like that, and Paul just goes along with it," Marianne reminisced. "What happened when she tried to take Danny?" Dot asked. "I'd rather not talk about it," Marianne replied. They continued the rest of their walk in silence. Dot pissed in Gertrude's bed again a few days later. Gertrude was livid and swore that she'd kill Dot. Marianne quietly suggested to Paul that they take Gertrude to a doctor since she kept wetting the bed and hadn't been herself lately. Paul brushed it off. He was embarrassed for Gertrude, something he wasn't used to feeling. Marianne washed the sheets again. They'd figured it would be too suspicious if Dot were the one cleaning up. When Marianne got back into bed, she tapped Paul on the shoulder and said, "Paul, she might have a urinary tract infection. That can cause stuff like this, even her behaviour lately. She'll need an antibiotic if that's what it is." The suggestion of a medical explanation caused Paul to soften up a little, and he agreed to take Gertrude to a doctor. Gertrude was rude to the doctor, of course, and after ruling out a UTI, the doctor suggested the possibility of cognitive impairment due to Gertrude's age. Gertrude was insulted by this and abruptly left the doctor's office before he could say anything more. "I'm telling you, it was Dot who pissed the bed and threw all the plates," Gertrude screamed at Paul out in the waiting room. Paul tried to calm her down and said he believed her, even though he wasn't sure he really did. Gertrude continued screaming in German, which Paul could understand but not speak. A security guard came over to them and said he'd call the police if they didn't leave the clinic. Dot and Marianne kept out of Gertrude's way for a while. They did subtly move her things around though, to make her seem forgetful. Paul was starting to think maybe the doctor was right about cognitive impairment. Around 6 months into Dot's stay, she pulled Marianne aside and said, "It's time for the grand finale." She took a small bottle of liquid LSD out of her pocket and handed it to Marianne. Then she whispered the plan. Dot shat in Gertrude's bed that night. She didn't wake up or realize until the next morning. It was a Saturday, so everyone was home except Danny, who was staying at a friend's house. There was a big commotion as expected. Eventually Gertrude went to have a shower and Dot went out with Michelle for the day. While Gertrude was in the shower, Marianne made a pot of coffee with the liquid LSD. Paul didn't drink coffee, so she didn't have to worry about him having any. She poured a cup for herself and Gertrude, but she only pretended to drink hers. About an hour later, Gertrude started losing her mind. She was confused, disoriented, and lashed out violently whenever Paul or Marianne tried to go near her. Marianne called an ambulance, and Gertrude was taken to hospital. Because of her age, they didn't bother doing any drug tests, just sedated her and made some physical observations. The doctor talked to Mary Ann and Paul about what was going on with Gertrude and recommended putting her in a nursing home, stating that it wasn't safe having her in the house with their son. At first, Paul refused, but when the doctor told him they would have to alert child protection if they took Gertrude home with them, he reluctantly agreed. So Gertrude was sent to a nursing home after being discharged from the hospital. Paul went to visit her there the next day. Mary Ann was concerned that Gertrude would be sent back after not showing the same behaviour in the nursing home. "Don't worry about that," said Dot. "I have some friends in that place who would be more than happy to keep gaslighting everyone and slip her the occasional dose of LSD. For a moment, Mary Ann felt guilty, but then she remembered how awful it had been when Gertrude had tried to take her baby, and all the other things Gertrude had done to make her life miserable while puppeteering her husband, and the small fragment of remorse that she had felt slipped away.